I'm not suggesting Queen Camilla lacks authority, but that tiara isn't hers. It rightfully belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, for the Christmas gala at Buckingham, you know.
The order was only 3 pages long, but the moment Princess Helena of Styria pressed her seal against the final line, Queen Consort Isolde's ceremonial life inside the monarchy was effectively erased. No warning reached the public. No gentle statement softened the blow. Within the hour, household officials were quietly instructed to remove the Queen Consort from every remaining procession, investiture, state banquet, and formal ceremony on the royal calendar. And the order had come from the one person Isolde never believed would move against her, her husband's own sister. Helena read the final clause twice before she signed it. Her hand hovered above the parchment because she understood exactly what her signature would cost. The instrument in front of her was what the Vestirian court called a writ of precedence, a rarely used mechanism that allowed a senior member of the royal house to formally suspend another royal's ceremonial standing when the dignity of the crown was judged to be at risk. It did not dissolve a marriage. It did not strip a title. It did something narrower and, in its way, crueler. It barred Isolde from ever again standing in the places where royal authority was displayed to the public. Isolde received word of it while dressing for a charity gala. She dismissed her lady's maid, unpinned the sapphire brooch from her gown, and set it back in its case without a word. Anger came first, then something colder settled in behind it: humiliation. State openings, remembrance services, investitures, state banquets, and national ceremonies. All of it gone in a single afternoon. Those appearances had been the proof, hard-won over 11 years, that she belonged beside King Anders. Their removal now exposed how conditional that belonging had always been. Helena sat alone with the signed writ long after the ink had dried, staring at her own name as though it might explain itself back to her. She had invoked the writ under a private clause reserved for the firstborn council, the small circle of senior working royals empowered to act when they believed the crown's public standing was in genuine danger. This was not spite, she told herself. It was containment. Down the corridor, King Anders opened his sealed copy in silence. He read his sister's signature, read the clause beneath it, and set the file down without ordering it destroyed. He did not summon Helena. He did not summon Isolde. Instead, he asked his private secretary a single question. How quickly could the autumn ceremonial program be revised? That question changed everything. A king who wished to overrule his sister would have said so in that moment. His silence told the household, in the particular language courts used to communicate without speaking, that the writ would stand, and that it would soon become public knowledge. When Isolde finally confronted him, she asked who had authorized such a thing. The answer came back quietly. Helena had not signed alone. A second name sat just beneath hers on the page, and that second name turned a bitter, private family quarrel into something closer to an institutional verdict Isolde could no longer wave away as jealousy or grudge. But before she could find out whose signature that was, Isolde had to face a harder truth first, that this decree had not been born in a single afternoon. It had been building, quietly, for the better part of 2 years. Behind the writ stood 3 people bound by duty and separated by fear. Helena believed she was protecting an institution her late father had entrusted to the family's collective judgment, not to any one person's marriage. Anders faced the uncomfortable possibility that defending his wife too loudly might make the crown look governed by affection rather than duty. And Isolde, suddenly cut out of the ceremonies that had legitimized her place at court, felt something even more personal slipping away. The acceptance she had spent over a decade trying to earn. Helena had always treated royal service as an obligation, not a perk to be distributed by marriage. The crown, the institution itself, distinct from whoever happened to sit closest to the throne, could absorb private pain. It could not absorb public doubt about who actually held authority. She had built her reputation on the idea that discipline mattered more than comfort. Signing the writ meant living by that idea, even when it hurt people she genuinely loved. Anders stood at the window of his study with the writ still in his hand when Isolde came to find him. She asked, plainly, whether he intended to defend her. He didn't answer right away. He lowered the pages, looked past her rather than at her, and said nothing for a long moment, and the silence landed harder than any argument could have. To Isolde, the ceremonies weren't hollow tradition. They were the visible proof, the only proof that mattered to the country watching, that she had finally been accepted as queen consort, a title that placed her beside the monarch without granting her any of his constitutional authority. She stepped closer and asked him again. This time he turned to face her, though his eyes still wouldn't quite meet hers. She understood in that moment what he was actually afraid of, that defending her too forcefully would make the crown look like it answered to marriage rather than to duty. That fear cut deep, because she'd spent years surviving public skepticism only to learn that acceptance could vanish the instant it threatened to cost her husband his reign. Helena, meanwhile, kept returning to a conversation she'd had with her late father years earlier, a private conversation, never recorded anywhere but her own memory, in which he'd warned her that affection must never be allowed to override the monarchy's judgment. The memory made her sad. It also steadied her resolve. She hadn't signed the writ because she hated Isolde. She'd signed it because she believed hesitation would cost the institution more than confrontation would. Then Isolde looked again at the final page of the writ and found the second signature beneath Helena's. It belonged to Crown Prince Matthias, Anders and Helena's nephew, heir to the throne. His support meant this was no longer one sister-in-law's grievance. It was an alliance between the family's most senior working royal and the man who would one day wear the crown himself. Anders finally spoke. Helena and Matthias hadn't acted on instinct alone, he admitted. There was a documented account of one specific incident, something that had happened during a formal rehearsal months earlier, serious enough that even he could no longer wave it off as ordinary family friction. That incident had taken place weeks before, during a private rehearsal for the kingdom's annual Order of the Falcon procession at Ashford Castle. What should have been a routine, tightly choreographed run-through became, in hindsight, the moment nobody could walk back from. With only senior royals and a handful of household officials present, Isolde challenged Helena's position in the procession, demanded the formation be rearranged, and invoked Anders's authority as though his name alone could settle any objection raised against her. She expected the matter to be resolved on the spot. The Order of the Falcon procession was one of Asteria's oldest formal ceremonies. Senior royals walked in an order determined by rank, decades of service, and long-established tradition. The positions weren't a matter of personal preference. They told the watching public, plainly, who carried responsibility within the institution, who represented continuity, and who stood closest to the throne's authority. Helena had earned her place near the front through decades of service and her long-standing military patronages. Isolde believed that her position beside the king should place her ahead of that. She turned to the equerry overseeing the rehearsal and ordered him to move Helena further back in the line. Before he could respond, she added, sharply, that the princess would need to adjust to the new reign. Helena heard every word. She stepped forward, not with raised voice, but with a stillness that made the room feel colder than the actual temperature. She told Isolde, evenly, that ceremonial precedence was not a personal reward to be reassigned on request. Isolde answered that the monarchy now took its direction from the king's household, and that old arrangements couldn't be allowed to dictate the future. Anders stood only a few feet away throughout the exchange. He lowered his gaze and said nothing. That silence wounded Helena more than the confrontation itself, because it let the challenge stand unanswered and, worse, let his wife believe his name alone could override established tradition without consequence. A household secretary recorded the exchange in the official rehearsal log, a routine document used to track decisions and disputes during ceremonial planning. According to that log, Isolde had attempted to alter an established order of precedence without the formal authority to do so. Attached to the same file were earlier notes describing similar attempts, requests involving guest seating, procession order, and public presentation, going back well over a year. Matthias read the file privately, weeks later. He'd expected to find one isolated argument. Instead, he found a pattern, a slow, repeated effort by Isolde's office to expand her influence over events that carried real public meaning. Reading it, he understood why Helena no longer viewed the Ashford rehearsal as a simple misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with an apology. Helena kept her composure until the rehearsal ended. On her way out, she told Matthias that whatever conversation came next could not happen in front of courtiers or secretaries, anyone capable of softening the truth on either side. The future king agreed. When Helena finally sat down alone with Isolde, there were no aides in the room, no one to interrupt or soften the exchange. Neither woman intended to back down. The door closed on 11 years of unspoken resentment. Isolde stood by the fireplace and didn't offer her sister-in-law a seat. Helena set the Ashford rehearsal log on the table between them and asked one direct question. Had Isolde genuinely come to believe that marrying the king gave her authority over royals who had served the crown for decades before she'd arrived? Isolde pushed the folder aside. The log was simply the official written record of what had been said and done at Ashford, who had challenged the established order, and why the household considered it serious enough to note formally. Helena had requested this private meeting as a last chance for Isolde to accept limits voluntarily, before anything more formal was put in motion. No writ had been drafted yet. No public statement existed. There was still a narrow path away from disaster. Isolde accused Helena of never having accepted her, not once, not in 11 years. Every correction, every cool silence, she said, had carried the same message underneath it, that no matter what title she held, the family would always regard her as an outsider who'd married in rather than been born to it. Helena didn't raise her voice. She answered that personal acceptance meant nothing if the credibility of the crown itself was being put at risk in the process. Ceremonial influence, she reminded her, was not the same thing as constitutional authority. Isolde's reach had grown steadily through household planning, through direct access to Anders, through recommendations quietly passed along by loyal staff. But none of that amounted to formal authority to reposition senior royals or rewrite established processions, and none of it turned the king's personal affection into institutional permission. Isolde's composure finally cracked. She admitted she had spent over a decade absorbing public scrutiny, private suspicion, and quiet condescension, only to be treated, once again, as temporary. Her pain was genuine, and for a moment Helena felt it too, and softened slightly. Then she said, gently but firmly, that suffering did not create entitlement, and old wounds could not be allowed to calcify into new claims on power. Helena told her that Matthias had reviewed every documented incident himself, and that he was prepared to support formal restrictions unless Isolde stepped back from select ceremonies voluntarily. The future king didn't see this as punishment. He saw it as protecting an institution. He would one day be responsible for himself. Isolde rejected the compromise outright. Stepping back voluntarily, she said, would look like an admission of guilt, and she warned that Anders would never allow his sister and his nephew to humiliate his wife in that way. Helena picked the log back up and moved toward the door. Before leaving, she gave Isolde one last piece of information. The king had already read the entire file. Isolde said nothing. For the first time, she understood that Anders's silence might not have been weakness after all. It might have been consent. The true weight behind what came next wouldn't be found in anything Anders said. It would be found in the authority he chose, quite deliberately, not to use. He could have stopped the whole crisis with a single instruction. He could have rejected Helena's writ outright, ordered Matthias to withdraw his signature, and restored Isolde's full ceremonial standing before a single revised program went to print. Instead, he sat with the unsigned writ in front of him for 2 full days and made a choice that would define everything that followed. He would neither endorse the writ publicly nor block it privately. As reigning monarch, one direct countermand from him, a formal instruction reversing an earlier decision, would have ended the matter immediately. No such instruction ever arrived. That silence was, in itself, the decree's real source of force. Ceremonial offices, household planners, and senior aides all treated Helena and Matthias's writ as authorized precisely because the sovereign had chosen not to stop it. Alone with his private secretary, Anders turned his signet ring slowly around his finger and asked whether Isolde could keep her charitable patronages while stepping back from crown ceremonies specifically. Those ceremonies, the formal public duties carried out in the sovereign's name, were, in his own mind, a separate category from private loyalty. Asking the question at all told him the truth before he was ready to admit it out loud. He was already planning around the suspension, not against it. His secretary asked carefully whether he wanted to speak with his wife before the ceremonial program was formally revised. Anders closed his eyes. Every previous conversation with Isolde on this subject, he said, had ended with duty being received as betrayal. He feared another confrontation, but his hesitation was no longer a neutral act. Every additional day without intervention made the writ harder to reverse. Beneath the rehearsal log in his own hand, Anders had written a single line. The dignity of the institution must take precedence. 6 words. He never made them public. But they gave Helena the moral ground she needed to know she hadn't misjudged the situation. He hadn't endorsed her decision aloud. He had, however, privately accepted the reasoning behind it. The ceremonial office began revising the autumn program within days. Names disappeared quietly from investitures, remembrance services, state banquets, and national events. Then one change landed harder than all the others combined. At the kingdom's next national remembrance service, the seat beside King Anders, long occupied by Isolde, was reassigned to Crown Princess Ellen, Matthias's wife. When the revised seating chart reached Isolde's desk, the absence of her own name was painful enough. The name written in its place made the loss unbearable. She read through the document without speaking. Her name was gone from the arrival procession, gone from the front row seating plan, gone from the formal departure beside Anders. In the space where she had always expected to stand, officials had written Ellen's. For the first time since becoming queen consort, Isolde wasn't simply being asked to step out of view. She was watching someone else quietly assume the exact position she'd spent a decade believing proved she belonged. She asked her lady-in-waiting whether Ellen had requested the position. The answer came back immediately. She hadn't. The princess had simply been assigned the role once the revised program was approved. That answer unsettled Isolde more than almost anything else that had happened. Ellen hadn't taken anything from her. The institution had simply moved forward without asking either woman's permission. Anders came to find her that evening. She refused to look at him. She asked whether he had personally chosen Ellen for the role. He told her, quietly, that the institution had chosen continuity, not him, not personally. The distinction wounded them both, because it laid bare exactly how far marriage and monarchy had drifted apart under the strain of the last few weeks. He still loved his wife. He had also, in practice, allowed the crown to place someone else beside him in public. Isolde learned that afternoon that several members of her own household staff were being quietly reassigned as well, since ceremonial planning no longer ran through her office. The suspension, she understood now, wasn't symbolic. It was actively reshaping the structure of influence around her. That evening, a handwritten note from Helena arrived. It offered Isolde one path back toward dignity. Accept the suspension publicly, avoid placing blame on Anders, and meet privately before the remembrance service to settle the terms between them directly. Isolde read it twice. This time, fear arrived before anger did. Against her advisor's objections, she dismissed them and agreed to meet Helena alone. She was no longer preparing to defend her position. She was preparing to find out whether anything of her royal life could still be salvaged. Their second private meeting wasn't a fight over precedence. It became something closer to a reckoning between two women who finally understood exactly what it had cost to force Anders into choosing a side. Isolde arrived without jewelry, without staff, without the composed confidence she'd carried into their first confrontation. Helena was already waiting beside a small table. This time, no writ sat between them. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Isolde admitted something she hadn't been able to say out loud before. That she had mistaken visibility for security, that she believed every seat beside Anders, every place in a procession, was what kept her from becoming an outsider again. She had come alone this time because this conversation couldn't survive being filtered through procedure or softened by staff standing nearby. Helena had no intention of reversing the writ that evening. Her purpose was simpler and harder, to find out whether Isolde would keep resisting publicly or accept, finally, that her role had genuinely changed. Isolde apologized for Ashford. She admitted that ordering Helena to move hadn't come from confidence, it had come from fear. She believed, deep down, that the family still saw her as temporary, as tolerated rather than accepted, kept in place only because Anders loved her. Every ceremony had felt like proof otherwise. Losing them had reopened a wound she'd thought she'd closed years ago. Helena listened without interrupting. Then she acknowledged, plainly, that the family's history had caused Isolde real and lasting harm, and that she'd endured a decade of judgment few people ever fully understood. But Helena refused to let pain be mistaken for authority. She told her that the king's affection could never become ceremonial power on its own, and that suffering, however real, didn't grant anyone the right to bend the crown around personal fear. Isolde asked quietly whether the suspension meant permanent exile from royal life. Helena answered that it wasn't designed to erase her forever. A future review remained possible. If she respected the household's boundaries going forward, served without demanding precedence, and rebuilt trust through quiet, consistent duty rather than public position. The path was narrow, but it existed. Isolde read through the private acceptance statement slowly. It confirmed that she took responsibility for the disruption and wouldn't place public blame on Anders, Matthias, or Helena. She signed it. In exchange, Helena withdrew the harsher public language originally drafted for the household's formal statement, replacing punishment with restraint. Before leaving, Isolde asked one last question. Who would stand beside Anders at the remembrance service now? Helena looked at her and answered with 2 words, the future. The next morning, that answer played out in front of the entire kingdom. Crowds gathered outside the cathedral, expecting the familiar formation. Instead, the first visible sign of change arrived before any official statement had even been read aloud. Anders stepped from the state car alone. Moments later, Matthias, Ellen, and Helena entered together in the formal procession. Isolde was absent. The empty space beside the king became the image every broadcast returned to for the rest of the day. Anders paused briefly at the cathedral entrance and turned, instinctively, toward the place where his wife would normally have stood. The movement lasted only a second. Helena saw it. She kept walking anyway, because stopping would have exposed exactly how much the decision had cost. The household released a brief, carefully worded statement confirming that Isolde had stepped back from ceremonial duties while continuing selected charitable work and private family life. Reaction inside the household split sharply. Some staff feared the announcement had exposed a genuine fracture in the family. Others believed the boundary had prevented a much deeper struggle over who actually controlled public royal authority. Isolde watched the service from home. When the broadcast showed Anders arriving alone, she grew tearful but didn't reach for the phone. She had promised Helena she wouldn't challenge the arrangement publicly, and keeping that promise now cost her more than signing any document had. One newspaper the following morning ran the entire story under a single headline: "The Crown draws a line." The phrase spread quickly because it compressed a genuinely complicated family conflict into one blunt truth. The monarchy had drawn a boundary, and Isolde stood on the far side of it. Public reaction never turned into outrage the way her advisors had feared. Instead, the country simply waited to see whether she would accept the loss with dignity or try to reopen the wound. By that evening, Isolde understood she could not reclaim what she'd lost. What she could still decide was what kind of woman the monarchy would remember her as. In the end, the writ hadn't ended a marriage, stripped a title, or driven Isolde out of royal life altogether. It had done something narrower, and in many ways harder to live with. It had separated personal love from public authority. Helena's signature had declared, in the clearest terms available to her, that affection for the king could not translate into unlimited influence within the crown. Isolde's acceptance proved something too, that losing ceremonial status didn't have to mean losing every remaining piece of dignity. She withdrew permanently from the monarchy's central ceremonial program, while her charitable patronages, family appearances, and private life beside Anders remained intact. The ceremonial program itself, the official calendar of public rituals carried out in the sovereign's name, had once been the proof of her acceptance. Now it marked the boundary she could no longer cross. That evening, Anders sat beside her and took her hand. He admitted he should have set clear limits himself, long before his own silence forced his sister and his nephew to act in his place. Isolde listened without pulling away. She told him, finally, that she'd spent too many years trying to prove she belonged by standing in the most visible place available to her, only to discover that titles, processions, and physical proximity to the throne had never actually guaranteed belonging in the first place. Helena returned to her office that night with the unused draft of the harsher original statement still in hand. She read it once, then destroyed it. She had never wanted public humiliation. The writ had been meant to protect the crown from personal overreach, not to erase the soul from the family or end her marriage.